Welcome to the Evidence-Based Marketer. I'm Andrea Loyne, Digital Marketing Strategist here at Symmetry Partners. Today, we want to talk to you about two tools to plan a successful 2022. William Chettle, my co-host, recently sat down with Tom Romano, our Director of National Sales, to discuss tools that will set the right strategic direction for your business and help you to leverage what makes you unique and focus on your true competitive advantages. Now, let's turn it over to them to continue the discussion.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Two Tools to Plan a Successful 2022 and Happy New Year. Traditionally, this is a great time of the year to start planning out the rest of your year and how you want to succeed. What's interesting is that some of the most successful advisors, if you look at studies done by Schwab, actually have a written plan. And we're going to bring to you today two tools that can help you craft both a larger strategic plan and an actual plan for growth. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Tom Romano, who heads up sales for us, and Andrea Loyne, who handles digital marketing for us. Both of these tools are available. If you look at the handout section, you can download them and follow along. And I would also encourage you to, if you'd like us to help you with them, if you'd like to schedule a meeting to actually go through the growth plan or the strategy canvas, just put that in the chat panel and we'll schedule a time that works so that we can actually walk you through step by step how to do it and reflect on your own individual circumstances. We've got a lot to cover, and so I'm just going to turn it over to Tom to talk about the strategy canvas. And this is a really, really powerful tool. Tom, you've used this over the years with dozens of advisors, and in many cases, you've really helped them actually chart out a new path for future success and had a lot of aha moments that kind of changed the things that they were doing in their practice and allowed them to make new strategic choices.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, William, and Happy New Year to everybody. This is a really cool tool that I like to use and help advisors kind of figure out what their next steps are going to be. It's a great year-end planning tool to figure out what you're doing in the next 12 months or so, and there are a number of firms who will ask us to run this exercise on their behalf every few years or so. The reason why I like it is, one, it's a simple output. It's a two-dimensional graph, X and Y axis, which we'll see. But it does really three things if you do it well. It's going to bring you focus in the activities that you're doing to grow your business. It should lead to differentiation in terms of how you compete with the competition. And then it also can really help from a marketing standpoint, right? William, you and I have worked together on these things. It can lead to things like a tagline, to a value proposition, and really accentuating those factors of competition that can make a firm stand out from the rest. If you don't mind clicking.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, sure. And I just think it's a great way to start, because the growth plan is much more tactical. And this is, I think it's really important before you jump to tactics to have that sense of what makes you different. Where can you compete? Where do you want to compete? And that's what I think is the real value of this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of times when we work with advisors on their growth plans, they tend to start with tactics versus starting with a clearer vision and strategies, and then using those tactics to fulfill that vision and mission, if you will. And there's a couple of ways you can skin this cat. I've seen advisors use this workbook on their own. My recommendation is to include your staff. I think that you'll get a lot of insights when you include your staff in doing this exercise. And also, as William said, we're happy to help facilitate these. Sometimes having a third party come and walk you through this makes a lot of sense. But essentially what we want to do with the strategy canvas is to look at a specific industry, in this case it's financial services, and determine what we call the factors of competition within that industry. A better description for a factor of competition is a reason why a customer would choose to work with you versus somebody else, or choose to work with your competition versus you. Now, a lot of things that we see with the strategy canvas is that there's not necessarily right or wrong answers. What one firm decides to do, what one RIA decides to do to be different, someone else might want to stay away from, and that's okay. But the exercise itself will point out what those things are. So what we will do is identify what those factors of competition are for financial services. Then we want to take a look at your personal firm and how you invest in those factors of competition, not just from a monetary standpoint, but also from a resource and time standpoint. And then what you want to do is plot your competition. And what that'll do is show you what your value curve is in the industry. And that should tell you those three things that I discussed in the beginning, right? It should give you focus. It should tell you how you're different and how you can further differentiate yourself. And once again, it kind of is a nice launch pad to a deeper marketing conversation. So the first step is really to brainstorm what the factors of competition are. And I recommend that you want somewhere between 6 or 8 that are most important, right? Typically, when I do this exercise, we'll come up with somewhere around 20 or so factors. But for purposes of plotting your value curve, somewhere between 6 and 8 factors makes a lot of sense. And some of the factors that we see through the exercise that we've done in the past, obviously, price is one. If you are, choosing to compete on price, for instance, that would be a very high investment. It's a little counterintuitive, right? Whereas if you're not competing on price, then it wouldn't be as big of an investment. But we also see things like client communications and education, time spent on that as a factor of competition. Having an investment philosophy is something that comes up quite a bit. Marketing and branding certainly comes up quite a bit. And there's a number of these factors that we've seen, and I usually don't like to give them all away. That kind of defeats the purpose of the brainstorming, right, William?
Yeah. And would you say that it sometimes can actually be helpful when you're talking to clients, especially if you have a client advisory board or do client surveys, understanding what they value most about you might be some great factors of competition. So if they value the fact that you're comprehensive or that you provide great service, those might be things to put into the mix.
Absolutely. And there are a number of advisors that we work with that do have an advisory board that consists of their most trusted clients. And if you have one of those, which I highly recommend that you do, giving your clients a voice and letting them tell you what they value really helps going through this process when you know that information.
And it's okay, right, Tom, to say something like, I'm just not going to compete there. For example, price. For most financial advisors, everyone's pretty much priced the same. The people that are competing on price are the robos. And, that's probably not a place where most advisors are going to want to play. And so that probably might not be a major factor of competition that you'd want to focus in on.
That's absolutely correct. You will run into customers that want the lowest cost no matter what. And I do run into advisors that want to compete on cost. I tend to advise against that. I mean, if you're competing on cost, to your point, William, you're competing with Vanguard. And I would argue that they probably already won that battle, right? So you want to pick a factor of competition that gives you some room to differentiate and some room to gain a competitive advantage. And, one thing that you could offset price with as a factor of competition is services, right? And so we've seen that as well.
Yep. And you want to be realistic, don't you? There's an example of an advisor you're working with who thought that technology was their big differentiator.
Sure, and that's a really good point that you bring up. We were talking about that the other day, and that's also a reason why you want to have your staff in the room. We had an advisor that had gone through this process and was adamant that they are different and making huge strides in investments in technology because during the pandemic they were using Zoom. And it was the staff that said, well, quite frankly, those are now table stakes, right? I mean, everybody's doing Zoom. So if you're not investing in Zoom or Teams or GoToMeeting or any one of those virtual services during the last 24 months or so, then you're putting yourself at a competitive disadvantage. And so sometimes what we see it was once a competitive advantage sometimes becomes table stakes. And some things you need to be doing at minimum at a satisfactory level just to be in the game. And I would argue this day and age, especially what we've seen over the last couple of years, being able to communicate with your clients virtually isn't necessarily a leg up, but it's a necessity, and you have to do it at least at a satisfactory level. Certainly. One thing I do want to mention, because we do run into this with some advisors when we're doing this brainstorming of the factors of competition, advisors will have a tendency to put things down that I would say are byproducts. Like, for instance, I've heard many advisors say that trust is a factor of competition, right? And I don't think trust is something that somebody who's brand new to you is going to say, like, hey, I'm working with ABC Advisory because I trust them, but I've never worked with them before, right? I think trust is a byproduct of other things that you can be doing, such as investor education, advisor education. We do have a lot of advisors who commit a lot of time, energy, and resources in educating themselves, and that's something that I think investors could value. And so those are the things that matter.
Or a niche specialty, right? That's a great way to earn trust. If you specialize in doctors or dentists or farmers, and you really know that niche well, and their unique financial challenges and opportunities, that's a great way. I think expertise helps lead to trust.
Yeah, absolutely. The advisors that operate in a niche, at least in my experience, have a tremendous factor of competition. I mean, that's a tremendous way to differentiate themselves from the rest. It's interesting. Both my parents were school teachers. They both taught high school, and when they retired, they started working with a local firm called the Connecticut Teachers Retirement Advisory Firm, or something along those lines, but literally said Connecticut Teachers Retirement. My parents didn't interview any other advisors. That was someone who was speaking to them just in the title of their firm. And I would say that firm is making a big investment in their niche because of the fact that they're actually naming their practice after the type of people that they service. And the type of people they service are gravitating to them.
Tom, would you say it's a good idea when you're thinking about these factors of competition to think about actually who your competition is? I know that's part of the process in the other steps of this, but it might help to think about who you actually are competing with. You're probably, not competing directly with the robos. You're probably not competing necessarily with hedge funds. And so you want to actually think about who, when clients are sort of making a decision between you and that someone else, who is that someone else, and that's where the factors of competition maybe come into play more, particularly, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of where it helps maybe getting a third party into the mix. Symmetry, Williams' team, the marketing team, the sales team, my team. We have a unique seat in that we talk with hundreds and thousands of different types of businesses and advisors all day long. And so we can kind of help identify what the competition is. I do say it's also geographical. We do a lot of these strategy canvases for firms in the Midwest, and there tends to be an Edward Jones office on every corner, kind of like a Dunkin' Donuts here in Connecticut, right? They're all over the place. Maybe it's a wirehouse you're competing with, or maybe it's a local RIA or another independent advisor, but knowing who your competition is and some of the reasons why someone may choose to work with them versus working with you, and vice versa. That's a little bit of the homework you want to do before you engage in this exercise.
So once you brainstorm the factors of competition, what's next?
So once you brainstorm your factors of competition, you narrowed it down to your 6 to 8. What you want to do is, I can see there on the x-axis, those are going to list the factors of competition. And it doesn't matter what order you put them in. And the next step is, you can see on that y-axis is your level of investment, right? A low investment versus a high investment. And as I said before, that has to do with not just monetary investment, but also your time, your resources, things like that. And so once you have your factors of competition on the x-axis, you need to make a decision on a scale of 1 to 10 as to how much you're currently investing in those factors. And so this is your as-is profile. This is where you are today. And what that'll show you is your value curve today. A couple of things that you want to make sure of is that you can't be a 10 on every single factor of competition, right? You don't have infinite resources, right? And so in order to invest in one thing heavily, something else has to give. And so what I always try and tell advisors when we're going through this exercise, there probably should be 2 or 3 things that you do or you're investing in very heavily currently. And they should be somewhere between an 8 or a 9 or a 10 on the investment side. And there are going to be some things that you're going to have to do at minimum at a SaaS factory level, whether it's having a way to virtually communicate with your clients in a pandemic, or sometimes things like compliance. Like I don't know if any investor chooses a firm because they're more compliant than another firm, but you have to have compliance just to be in the game, and you have to be able to perform it at a satisfactory level.
And you're not choosing if you have problems with the compliance.
Correct. Exactly. But you can't invest in everything, and if everything's important, nothing's important. And so, I really try to coach advisors when they're plotting their factors of competition, and then coming up with their level of investment. It needs to be a very honest conversation of where you are today in your business.
Tom, where do you see people typically in your conversations saying, "I'll satisfy us here. I'll do what's required." You gave the example of compliance, but are there other things that you often see?
Well, price, you brought it up before. I think you have to be competitive from a price standpoint. I mean, even if you don't want to compete with price to the extent of competing with the vanguards of the world, you also want to be reasonable in that regard. Other things that I've seen, and it, like I said, there's no right or wrong answer, but I worked with a group that, they thought networking was a factor of competition, and the group that they compete with spends a lot of time, joining various clubs. They're very known in their neck of the woods, and networking is not something that this advisor wanted to do. And so they said, I'll do it. I'll do enough of it. I'm not going to do it to the greatest extent. I'd rather compete in other areas. And what this particular advisor thought that was a better way to compete is that they have very robust financial planning offering, and they had a very specific investment philosophy, right? The competitor that they had plotted on the graph certainly was winning business through networking, but they didn't have an investment philosophy. They'd work with anyone if someone wanted tactical or active or passive or evidence-based, and whatever flavor you wanted. And so this advisor was competing with being more specific in their investment philosophy, and really leading with the financial planning aspect versus spending their resources on things like joining the Rotary or something along those lines.
Yep. And where do you often see that advisors, again, everyone's different, but where do you find that they typically decide that this is the two or three things that they really want to differentiate on?
Well, it's interesting. I always find in the as-is profile that there's always room to invest more. And one of the reasons why I like this exercise, it gives advisors a lot of focus, right? If you identify that, hey, you might have a niche in your book of business, and you see your as-is profile, and you look at the competition, and you determine, gosh, there's a way that I can really differentiate myself if I applied more focus on my niche or something along those lines, or if I'm earning business from CPAs, right, centers of influence, something along those lines. If I really focus heavier on those things in my 2B profile, which we'll talk about in a bit, that's where we really see the rubber hits the road, and advisors can now put together a really great strategy and employ tactics to achieve that level of differentiation. But it really helps to see it in a very simple two-dimensional graph, and that's why I love this exercise. It's easy to understand, it's easy to do, and there's a lot of value in it once you go through the exercise.
Yep. And again, we would be happy to help you with this. Just put in the chat panel if you're interested, that you'd like us to do the strategy canvas with you or the growth plan. And again, these are both downloadable via the handout section.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to mention a couple things that I've seen in strategy canvases in other industries, but not necessarily yet in our industry. There's this notion of an X factor. And what an X factor is identifying a factor of competition that you're going to be, for lack of a better description, maniacal about. And, I always think of Rockefeller and, his oil business, Standard Oil, right? The first billionaire in the United States. His factor of competition was transportation. And he was crazy about making sure that he could deliver and transport oil cheaper than the rest of the competition. And so that essentially was his X factor. And so you may have an X factor in your business, but going through this exercise would be able to shake that out.
Yeah. Elon Musk, Tesla, his X factor actually is supply chain. He has been maniacal about controlling his own supply chain. And this is one of the reasons that they've been able to avoid some of the supply chain issues other automobile manufacturers got it, sideswiped by in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also interesting notions like changing the landscape of the industry in of itself, right? I would argue that at one point, robos were changing the landscape. And they certainly did bring some variations to this exercise in different points of view in the industry, with focusing on cost and things like that. But coming up with a factor like the robo solution that is completely different, basically introducing a new factor of competition into the industry, is something we refer to as a blue ocean event. A really interesting one that I like is the notion of pods. That you might have seen these. Instead of taking your goods to a self-storage facility, pods brings the self-storage to you. They'll actually drop it off, put it in your driveway, and that was a blue ocean event, and it was a brand new factor of competition in the storage industry.
And I would argue, I mean, it's hard for financial advisors to blue ocean, but I would say that especially in terms of niches and maybe even some services, there's still some room. I mean, if you can be focused rather, there may be opportunities there. I mean, I know advisors who focus just on X and Y generation physicians. That's
Mm-hmm.
getting close to being a blue ocean. The family office structure, being a family wealth advisor. Again, not a lot of people in there right now, so a little bit more blue ocean. You're not completely revolutionary, but you're somewhere where a lot of advisors aren't currently.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked to a firm not too long ago that their whole value proposition is tax management. That's all they do. They only work with taxable accounts. It's kind of interesting. It's a very different approach. Like I said, there's no right or wrong answers here, but they're definitely differentiating themselves with what their value proposition is.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Evidence-Based Marketer from Symmetry Partners. If you have any questions, suggestions, or would like more information, please visit us at theevidencebasedmarketer.com.
Symmetry Partners LLC is an investment advisory firm registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The firm only transacts business in states where it is properly registered, excluded or exempted from registration requirements. Registration of an investment advisor does not imply any specific level of skill or training and does not constitute an endorsement of the firm by the Commission. No one should assume that future performance of any specific investment strategy, product, or non-investment related content made reference to directly or indirectly in this material will be profitable. As with any investment strategy, there is the possibility of profitability as well as loss. Due to various factors, including changing market conditions and/or applicable laws, the content may not be reflective of current opinions or positions. Please note the material is provided for educational and background use only. Moreover, you should not assume that any discussion or information contained in this material serves as the receipt of or as a substitute for personalized investment advice. Please note that nothing either stated or implied on this podcast is intended to be compliance or legal advice regarding your marketing program.